Hello and welcome to our latest podcast for the University of St Andrews Scotland's Future series. And we've got another really interesting, really fascinating topic that we're going to be discussing today, which is directly related to a Scotland's Future project. And I've even got a title that's been given to me, and the title is Podcasting for Freedom Scotland and the Making of the Decolonised World. So really current, really interesting. And I'm being joined today by Dr. Melinda Banerjee, originally from Calcutta, who is a lecturer in modern history at the University of St Andrews, who's specialising in the history of modern political thought and political theory. And I've also got Dr. Jo Mary Hale, who's a lecturer in the University of St Andrews in the School of Geography and Sustainable Development, and her PhD was in sociology with a focus on how social stratification such as class and ethnic disadvantage create inequalities in health and well-being. Now, Jo, I'm going to come to you in just a moment. Melinda, tell us a bit about your project and what you're trying to do.
Thanks so much, Stephen. As you will see from the name of the project, it's an allusion, obviously, to the Declaration of Arbroath, and it's 700 years since then. And it's also 75 years since the independence of India and Pakistan, and a century since the formal independence of Egypt. So the rationale behind the project was to look at two things, both related to Scotland's contribution to anti-colonialism, to decolonialism in Asia and Africa. So it consists of a historical strand and a futurist strand. The historical strand looks at the real importance of Scottish people, Scottish ideas in anti-colonial Asian and African politics. And this is a story that is fascinating, but has surprisingly never been told in a comprehensive way. For example, from the late 19th century, Indian travelers coming to Scotland were visiting the Wallace Monument. They were writing Bengali biographies of Robert the Bruce and William Wallace. They were very inspired by the writings of Walter Scott. And in turn, Scottish colonial administrators, even though they were operating, of course, within the constraints of empire, sometimes showed remarkable sympathy and solidarity for Indian peoples. For example, James Todd, a very interesting Scottish person, speaks about people in Rajasthan in northwestern India as being very similar to Scotland in terms of their organization into clans, their bardic chronicles, their loyalty, their fierce loyalty to their clan leaders, and fierce desire for freedom from outside invasions. Obviously, this kind of thing greatly inspired Indians to think again about the possibilities of freedom in pre-modern Indian pasts, and compared that with Scottish histories to think about, for example, the devastating effect of the Anglo-British state on both the highland clearances in Scotland as well as in the agrarian countryside in India, and thereby to think about what decolonization would mean as a global struggle. The other thing related to that, which is the second wave, is what can conversations between Scotland and Asian and African actors today contribute to decolonize the world. And I think we are living in a time of crisis. We are living in a time of pandemic, of mental health crisis, of climate catastrophe, of global warming, the sixth mass extinction. So how can we offer pathways where Scottish actors and ideas can nourish and be nourished by Asian and African ideas? And that's why we focus on Bhutan and think about things like community control of resources, rewilding, human-non-human relations, in order to kind of build a better world.
I want to come back to that because there's a lot trying to unpack so much of that. But Jo, can you tell us a little bit about your contribution to this and why does it matter? Why should we be thinking about this today?
Yeah, for sure. So I'll say first that Melinda and I met when we were at the Graduate School for Interdisciplinary Studies. So we were both program directors. So he's already talked about his program. I was the program director temporarily for the Sustainable Development Program. And so we met in that context, but I'll tell you that I ended up studying sustainable development and indeed sociology because I was really interested in inequalities and how inequalities manifested. And it occurred to me that the easiest way to understand the extent of inequalities in our world was to study health. And so I ended up studying health inequalities and really looking at racial ethnic differences in life expectancy, so how young people die. And I think it's really obvious sort of the moral requirement to do something about it when you can say, if you were born in this particular racial or ethnic or educational group, you will die X number of years younger.
Wow.
Right?
Okay.
And it's important for Scotland because Scotland is one of those populations that has woefully young life expectancy. So if people who live in Scotland have premature mortality that is 20% higher than people who live in England.
And I noticed recently a report came out showing that obviously our next door neighbours in Ireland have got the best life expectancy in the European Union. They're very, very close links. So do you want to just unpack a little bit more for us about why you may think that is, or what do we have to learn from each other? And I really picked up on Melinda talking about some of the lessons that we can pick up by having these conversations across continents.
Yeah, for sure. So I think actually there's a really interesting work by some other Scottish scholars, Jerry McCartney, Dr. Walsh, and some of what they looked at was the historical foundations for why Scotland's life expectancy is so low, right? Okay. And so thinking of legacies of disadvantage, of structural violence, and Melinda brought up the Highland clearances, and obviously that's going far. It's going kind of back into historical times, but even more recent. So the work that they published starts actually in the 50s, and thinking about modernization and post-industrialization, like this effort to bring Scotland and Glasgow especially, and so they moved people outside of Glasgow into sort of new settlements, and all of that contributed. So it's very relevant for Scotland, and I think one of the connections is my research on sort of contemporary health inequalities. But it seems so obvious that those inequalities are based in these legacies of disadvantage. And now I'm going to bring Melinda in
please,
to talk a little bit about how we think that we can bring Scotland and Bhutan and their experiences of decolonization and what we can move forward.
Okay, so Bhutan, which just for so many of us in Scotland and for many people listening, I'm sure it just seems like this place is quite far away. How much relevance is it to our day-to-day lives? But Melinda, you're going to tell us what it is, aren't you?
Of course. So one of the things that Joe rightly pointed out is current inequality, whether based along lines of class or gender, race, ethnicity, is the historical product of the Age of Empire, because the Age of Empire created social stratification, whether in Europe or in Asia and Africa. And Bhutan is really interesting because it was one of the very few countries in the world that escaped direct colonialism, which means that it was never directly colonized by any European power because it lay at the buffer zone between India and China. So Bhutan can offer us pathways of thinking about indigenous ways of multi-species justice, about human, non-human relations, about very ancient but very modern as well, ways of thinking about sustainable life that have withstood the direct assault of empire in a way that few other parts of the world have. And I think in a way, Joe and I, we are talking therefore of two things. One is the roots of present inequality, of the climate crisis, of global warming, of mass extinction, as a result of colonialism and colonial capitalism, but also pathways of finding what are the solutions, whether we are looking at it from these kind of anti-colonial struggles, from places like Bhutan, where humans, the way humans relate with yaks or cranes or vultures, is very different from the Western kind of meat industry, and learn from that together to create a better world.
Can you tell me a little bit about that? And Joe, I'll come to you in a moment about the relevance here, but I'm really interested. Now, when people are listening to this, talking about human, non-human interaction, multi-species engagement, they'll be wondering some will be thinking, what on earth are you talking about? Why is this of relevance to me? And then you start talking about vultures and yaks and all this kind of stuff. Yeah. So because this is fascinating and really interesting. So tell us, what have we got to learn from places like Bhutan, and why should we be interested?
Yeah. So one of the sayings I love from Bhutan is people say that humans and animals are parents of each other. Because in the Buddhist understanding of reincarnation, humans can be reborn as animals, animals can be reborn as humans. And they recognize the fact that animals have an idea of justice. If you, for example, exploit an yak too much, they will revolt. Yaks can distinguish between friends and strangers. They show love towards people who treat them kindly, and they would grunt or show resistance to those who treat them unkindly. But the Bhutanese look at vultures as models of ethical action, because vultures only eat dead bodies. And they have used the example of vultures to protest the creation of slaughterhouses in Bhutan. So slaughterhouses have not been introduced in Bhutan because people look at vultures as role models. They look at cranes as examples of models of romantic love, because cranes are incredibly loyal to each other, crane partners. So what all of this shows is that humans have always been aware that animals are role models, that animals live in ways that have something to teach us. So if you look at the Indian tradition of the Jataka stories and other stories, they're often animals are seen as role models of peaceful coexistence. Now, this is not something that is entirely unknown in Europe. If you look at, for example, Scottish ideas about the Selkies, there are ideas about human-seal relations there. Or if you look at a lot of European thinkers like Kropotkin and so on, they talk about the way that birds live, migrating birds live without fighting each other is the way that humans can live without, creating empires and genocides. And I think what Bhutan can teach us are exactly these ancient ways of living, which are also present in Europe, but because of industrialization, etc., have sometimes been forgotten.
So a different way of doing things. So Joe, you've got these really tough issues that you set out about life expectancy, about health, about inequalities. And Melinda's such an interesting way of thinking about things and how we can learn from Bhutan. So how does what Melinda's talking about and everything, how does that apply here?
Yeah, well, so I think one of your questions that you asked was about this multi-species well-being.
Yeah.
Like, what does that even mean,
what's
right?
it mean, yeah.
But I actually think a lot of people are thinking about that right now, specifically because of COVID, right?
Yeah.
This idea
Sure.
that the way that we structure food and agriculture and all of that has created a system whereby humans and animals are living cheek and jowl. And what that means is zoonoses, right? This passing of diseases back and forth between humans and animals that actually, I would say, in this precise moment, many more people are thinking about what that means that we live in this environment that's so different than our histories. And what it means to us and what it has meant to us in the last couple of years. So I think that a lot more people are becoming aware that it's not all about humans and our health, sort of as if we're silos and somehow not animals, right? We're all connected. And I would say that the idea of one health, this idea that all of us, that all beings are reliant on each other and interconnected, and Melinda brought up a lot of examples of I think when you start to realize that, kind of how that can help us move forward and think not just about human life expectancy and centralizing humans, but also what that means all around.
So I'm wondering if you could tell me what I'd be really interested in is when you're having this debate and discussion, you want to make it relevant. So talk to me, and Joe, I want to come to you first on this. Build on that for me and talk to me a wee bit about social justice. Why is this relevant to social justice? Why, so if you're talking to somebody and policymakers and others, we debate how can we make life better for people, and that's something you started on. So why does that cut across to social justice? Yeah,
for sure. I think there are two elements that I probably want to talk about. One is health injustice is obviously a social injustice. Yeah. So this idea that people live shorter lives, sicker lives, more miserable lives, right? That's
even
an
though
obvious.
They're just a couple of streets away from each other.
A couple of streets away, yes.
Yeah.
So that's an obvious sort of clear problem that we can put our finger on that and say this is not how we want our world to be structured. Yeah. And I think we can say the same not just for humans but for other animals. And I think I'm actually really impressed by Scotland's policies with regard to protecting animals, right? So Scotland has much better animal protection policy, non-human animal protection policies than many other countries. From dogs, and shot collars are illegal here, and tail docking, but also for pig farming and sheep and all the rest of it, right? So there's kind of that element, and then another element that we talked a little bit about previously, not in this moment, but in previous conversations, is about rewilding and thinking about that, right? Yeah. And so but I think we have to think of the histories of rewilding. So I have recently learned, actually, Scotland has no policy. Nowhere in policy is there anything about rewilding in Scotland. Okay. Which is interesting, right? So some of that is about sort of competing interests and thinking, what does it mean to rewild? And different populations have different ideas of what that means. And of course, there's farmers and there's hunters and there's all these conversations that really need to be had. Yeah. And thinking about ecological restoration. And I think this is the direct connection really between sort of the Scottish ecological restoration. What does it mean to restore something that has been lost? And in a moment of climate change. So what is it? We're not going to go back, right? We can't go back to sort of what it was prior to, even the clearances, right? Okay. So what is it going forward? What can we do in this moment?
That point on rewilding, really interesting, very live debate. a lot of people in urban areas might be less aware of it, but if you want to make sustainable rural areas, very live debate, very current debate, and obviously links into biodiversity, climate change, climate justice. But when you're talking about that life expectancy and this being relevant to the individual, who's maybe has these inequalities that you've talked about, suffering from a lower life expectancy than somebody just a couple of streets away. Can you talk to me a little bit more about that? And then I'm really interested, I'm going to come to you in a minute, Melinda, because I want to talk about what goes on in places like Bhutan or elsewhere, and that colonial legacy that you mentioned too.
Yeah, I mean, I think that to me, the colonial legacy, all of that is interconnected, and we can see it in policies. Like if you look at a country that has progressive policies that protects animals, they're also more likely to have progressive policies that protect humans, right? So things like social welfare systems, things like equal access to education for all, or equal access to primary school and preschool education, right? They're all very interconnected, and they're based on sort of, let's say, a value system. Okay. And so I would say that if a country chooses to construct a policy, a network of policies that is protective, then that needs to include humans, right? Things like access to early life childcare, right? So everyone's got access to school education, but what about the mom who has to go off to work and she doesn't really have anyone who can take care of her baby, right? Or she has to go back to work prior to the baby being old enough for her to go back to work, right? Like all of these sorts of policies, right, need to be, I think, considered at the same time as we think about the wider sort of ecological atmosphere or whatever, right? The ecological zone.
So in our policy making, we often think about things in silos, but actually we should be bringing these together and thinking about it in that broader way.
Absolutely. Okay. I mean, this is a slightly random example, but there's been quite a lot of research related to intimate partner violence and people who work in slaughterhouses, right? Yeah. So the connections amongst, how structural violence kind of comes down into person-on-person violence, and that sort of connection through society.
Melinda, tell us a little bit about what we might have to build on what you mentioned earlier on, because this is really interesting. Now, obviously, policymakers will often look at in Scotland and elsewhere in the UK, will look at other European countries, will look at the Nordics when it comes to these kind of issues. That's natural. But should we be looking a little bit further afield then?
I'm not sure if it's natural, because I think if you look at the 19th century earlier, Scottish thinkers in the 18th century, in the 19th century, were learning a lot from India and China and so on. So I don't think, that Nordic countries are the immediate neighbors of Scotland and India is quite the way of I would frame things. But I want to quickly catch on to what Joe has said about structural violence. And in my recent research with an anthropologist based in Bhutan, what we argue is that the first colonialism was when humans colonized the animal world, because they realized that animals live in polities, but then they decided to bring them under their subjugation. And the way that traditionally colonial rulers have looked at non-white peoples has often been using animal language. They are vermin, they are pests, they need to be eradicated. So the kind of structural violence that is there against nature and against people who are seen as being like natural or even like being animals, Africans and Asians, there's a very strong connection between that. So today, if you look at the most vibrant anti-colonial struggles among indigenous populations in North and South America, among the indigenous peoples, the Maoris of New Zealand, Aboriginals in Australia, Adivasi populations in India, for all these communities, emancipation means not just emancipation for those communities from elites, but also emancipation for their non-human kin. And they often look at mountains and others as their non-human kin. So, for example, in Peru, they look on mountains as Tiracuna, which in the Quechua language means earth beings. So any project of human emancipation to be really viable, I think needs to think about how humans can live in a world which is not only about humans, but about others as well. And if one looks at history, one sees really interesting examples. So in the 17th century, in the Sundarbans, which is this amazing, the world's biggest deltaic forest, you have this problem where human settlement in India, today shared between India and Bangladesh. You have on the Bay of Bengal, there is this fascinating kind of moment when human settlement is spreading into the forest, and then the tigers are not very happy with that. So what happens is a pact of alliance making between the spirit of the human settlement building and the tiger god to create sustainable ways of living with them. Now, all these memories still live on among people in India, in Bhutan, in South America, and so on, but they're often sort of crushed out of the mainstream media discussions. And what we need to recover, it's almost like being on a treasure hunt, is about recovering things that humanity always knew, and it's there as a treasure, but it's just not highlighted in the media and so on. And that is what we need to rediscover, not invent the wheel, but rediscover what you already know in our inmost spiritual being, that we are people for others. And that is exactly what our project is trying to activate.
Yeah. Well, look, and can you tell me just a little bit more about your project? Because you've talked about storytelling across, so that we try and learn from one another. We try and learn a little bit more about one another's cultures. Could you tell me a little bit more about that? And then I'll ask you, Joe, what you see yourself getting out of it as well in terms of what we learn.
Absolutely. I think storytelling is a really, really important issue. And Scotland obviously has a very interesting storytelling tradition as well. I was in Shetland over the Easter weekend, and I realized about this very fascinating tradition of storytelling involving humans, non-humans, spirits, etc., which makes me think Scotland is much similar in some ways to India or Bhutan than you would think, than maybe to industrial cities like London or New York. So I think, but storytelling is about understanding our place in the world, our rootedness. And I think one of the problems with literature from the 19th century, the novel especially, is that these became, in the words of a famous political theorist, these became a bourgeois form. It became concentrated on humans. Yeah. It forgot the fact that non-humans were traditionally always a very important part of storytelling, whether in ancient Greece or Italy or India or elsewhere. What we need to create today are new stories, new narratives, where people realize that other animals, that other humans are not commodities, not things that can be extracted for profit, but fellow beings, friends, with whom we are together creating stories. Because what we are looking at the moment is for a new epic, an epic of multi-species well-being. That is the adventurous, heroic new epic that we need. And we can do that in multiple ways. We can do that through storytelling, through poetry, through literature, and above all, perhaps, through children's fiction. Because if you notice, all of us remember from our childhood, it is in children's stories, whether in Beatrix Potter or in Tagore or so on, that animals figure most prominently. And as adults, we tend to think, oh, talking bunnies, that's not real. But in fact, that's real, because a lot of animal psychology and multi-species ethnography says animals have intelligence. They can distinguish between friends and strangers. They give gifts. They can have revenge. So all those children's stories, now seen as not real, are more real than the world that industrialization has created for us. And we need to recover that if we are to attack those histories of inequality, of commodification, of unchecked profit-making, which is ravaging the world today.
Okay, that's really, and so Joe, do you want to build on that and talk to me a little bit about the project and the relevance of those really serious issues that you brought up at the start?
Yeah, sure. So I think we both see this as a project that's moving towards undoing these centuries of violence that have been perpetuated in Scotland and in many other countries, and trying to understand ways that we can contribute to that undoing, and also ways to not just undo but build resilience. So resilience is a tricky term. Sure. Sometimes we don't like the term resilience because it suggests something like, no matter what happens to me, I should bounce back. Yeah. And what we want to do is have the bad thing that's happening to me stop happening so that I don't have to bounce back. Yeah. At the same time, resilience, I think, is a profoundly positive term, right? It suggests, there's a lot of spirit in the idea of resilience, right? That I think is really positive. And I think that we can build communities or networks of resilience. And I think that's part of what we're trying to do here. And it's a small community or network of resilience. It consists of some scholars here and some scholars in Bhutan. And, we have a PhD student, or we're hoping to have a PhD student start with us in the near future, who will also be looking at sustainable agriculture in Bhutan, and then coming back to Scotland to think about it here. So I think what we're trying to do is start start engaging in these dialogues and bringing students from Bhutan together with students from St. Andrews and other Scottish institutions, and get us just engaged in these dialogues. I mean, you said at a few minutes ago something about how it seemed like an odd fit, or what was the combo of these two places, and I think that's it's a fairly common thought that our listeners will have.
Yeah.
And so and yet we can see all these connections, all these really fascinating connections, and I think a lot of that is about geographical distance, right?
Yeah.
And so because we're so remote geographically, people don't necessarily think of these two countries as being as aligned as they are. And I think what we can show through this process is actually how aligned we are. We have all these amazing technologies that can help us have these conversations across the miles. And I think that process of just showing, of sort of like demystifying the other, right? I think that whole process will be really valuable both for our Scottish students and also for the students in Bhutan.
So very finally, what the big message I'm getting from you both is we've got these big challenges. Think differently. The pandemic gives you the opportunity to think beyond geography, and you can bring students together through video conferencing and other means. So I'm going to ask you first, Melinda, and then finish off with you, Joe. If we're asking people to think differently and have an open mind, what would be your message to people listening to this and why they should be engaging with some of the work that you're doing? Just very briefly.
I'll just quote two things. A Sanskrit proverb, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, all the world is our kin. And the Buddha's words, Bahujana Hitaya, Bahujana Sukhaya. Whatever we do should be for the well-being of the many and for the happiness of the many. We live in a world not as individuals, but as kin with other humans and other animals and other plants and species. And we need to create together a better world for social and ecological justice.
Perfect. Beautifully concise. Can you beat that?
No. But I will say that I think in this moment of climate crisis, in this moment of climate catastrophe and health crisis, I think people are thinking a lot more about what can we do differently, because what we are doing is not working, and it's been not working for a really long time. And I think that our project can help move in a direction of thinking, oh yes, here are some things that we can actually do in this wider context.
Well, do you know what? One of the reasons we did the Scotland's Future series was we're at a crunch point of a climate emergency emerging from the pandemic, war in Ukraine and Syria and elsewhere in the world, and so many things we need to think about. So thank you for helping me, certainly, and hopefully others listening to think about things differently. Good luck with your project, and we look forward to hearing more about it soon.
Thank you very much. Appreciate your time today.
Thank you, and thank you for listening.